Hey everyone, one last video. First, a few words about your final. All the directions are on the instruction page. Everything you need to know is up there. It's a little long. I explained this at the very beginning. I'm just trying to be very explicit. Let me know if anything isn't clear. For your final, I've asked you to report on your learning experience, whatever that was or wasn't. There's no right answer, okay? Because you're documenting how the class went for you. And everyone's going to have their own experience. Everyone's going to have their own essay about that. In describing your experience, you will be describing what you learned. Remember that one main goal for the assignment is to explain how you may have learned stuff, like the big points in various videos, that didn't necessarily show up in your posts because you were writing on a more specific question. This is your chance to make sure that work is visible to me and that you get credit for. It's your chance to get credit for stuff that you've learned from the course as a whole. That's kind of come together in the last couple weeks as we've done these review assignments, and now you're pulling everything together for your final. So as you describe your learning experience, you want to balance big picture analysis with specific details from the readings. Again, the big points lectures, especially the last few, now that we've had most of the course under our belts, should help you identify some themes and ideas that are pretty central to what we've been doing. So enough about the final. For a final wrap-up lecture, I guess I want to look back to the student learning outcomes that are on the syllabus. It's maybe the only thing on the syllabus that didn't change all semester, which is good. I mean, they're the guiding principles for the course. And we've had big points in the videos. These are the biggest points. These are the meta points. And I have a few concrete examples I want to point out from the course to illustrate some of these learning objectives, but this isn't meant to be a comprehensive review of class material. So just because I don't mention it in the video doesn't mean it's not important, doesn't mean you shouldn't mention it in your final. And you'll tell your own story, obviously, but this is just trying to give some examples to the bigger points. Number 1, interpret and explain the rhetoric of health in different historical periods. Think about how science is used, especially continuities and discontinuities in how that happens. For instance, Cheney used the idea of invisible mechanisms governing the body that only he, as an expert, could know. Vitamins, 200 years later, same thing. Invisible mechanisms of how the body interacts with food. In this case, chemical rather than mechanical. Crucial for the working of the body. Experts know about vitamins, and if you don't, right, even in 1920, you're not an expert. So this is an example of something we've seen over and over. We could do hours of examples here. General things like invisible mechanisms establishing expertise remains the same. Particular details change, right? Fluids and viscosity and flows and fluxes and stuff like that with Cheney to, chemical binding sites with vitamins, right? So the details change, but a lot of these main themes kind of move from one period to another. Similarly, in terms of risk, we could compare biocides, GMOs, various additives, regulatory procedure, all variations on a theme. Think about how Sylvester Graham was rhetorically very successful because of the way he could sort of fuse scientific evidence and religious and moral sentiments. That was the norm for the time. People didn't find that weird. That would look weird today, for sure. But I've also suggested how the moral components of dietary advice have persisted in modern dietary advice, even if they're more subtle. Anti-gluten diets are a very similar kind of thing, returning to a romantic version of purity in our food. The main idea remains the same. We want natural, pure, whole food. We see that today. We saw it with Graham. The details have changed, but the general theme remains the same. Another good example here is the role of individual choice. Compare the emphasis on body image in Lulu Peters versus the Barabee article. Obesity is an external environmental issue as much as it is a personal choice issue. In that case, there's a huge shift, right? This exclusive focus on you're eating too much sugar, you're eating too much candy, whatever Lulu Peters says. And then we have this other thing of Barabee saying, well, people might be doing maybe not the best diet, but there's lots of other reasons that are outside of their control, right? So fundamental shifts, in addition to these same themes that persist, there's also these discontinuities, okay? So keep in mind that balance. Number 2, outline how the establishment of dietary expertise has and has not changed over time. Some things that have remained constant. Personal anecdotes of success, right? We see this with Galen to some extent. We see it with Cheney for sure. We see it with Stephen Gundry, who we read about a couple weeks ago. He's the anti-lectin dude. I was unhealthy. I figured it out. If I can do it, anybody can do it. Even the meat dude. Tales of successes with patients, right? These physicians are also describing how many times they've given advice to people they don't really even know that well, which is kind of weird in itself, who follow the advice and it works really great, right? Which gives it an air of sort of universality, right? It can work for anyone. It sort of does. All the people who have asked me for it find it really great. The appearance of going beyond common sense, having scientific explanations for things that seem obvious, right? We've seen this in the meat diet. We saw it with Cheney. Things have changed in terms of how we establish dietary expertise. Formal training in nutrition, formal licensing of doctors, letters after people's names, all the different sort of certifications and degrees you can get, the kinds of evidence that we expect to be presented, the kinds of journals that get cited, right? We've made an effort over the last 200 years to really normalize expertise in nutrition. Who is an expert, right? But think of the food frequency questionnaires. Think of the long-term observational studies, industry-funded studies. How much can even the highest trained expert really know? How much is it possible to know at all? These are questions that history tells us something a little bit about that modern science really isn't concerned with. On a broader level, we should note that what constitutes an expert is always culturally determined, right? I just gave some examples, the licensing, degrees, and so on. Galen and Cheney don't use evidence in the same way that we would now. It doesn't make them less scientific. It just means that scientific culture is constantly moving. And precisely because cultural expertise of diet is constantly changing, our modern diet texts on the whole, not so much one here or there, but collectively, they tell us something about us, about who as readers or potential readers we are. What have we created a market for? What are the general expectations that these authors are responding to? Number 3, advance historical source analysis skills by evaluating primary sources on dietary advice. Well, we've done this throughout the semester. Even though some of the ones we were reading are very recent, we still consider them primary sources. They're about diet. We're evaluating them. We're asking them the same questions about anti-lectins as we are about calories with Atwater, right? Galen, Cheney, Graham, Atwater, Kellogg, Peters, Davis. We didn't read her exactly, but we've read a lot more authors in quotations and extracts and other sources. And we've looked at the same set of questions each time. What views are they likely to have? Who are they writing to? Why? What agendas do they have? How do they define terms like healthy or safe or risk? What is their audience expecting? I want to be real clear that the ways we analyze these earlier writers, going all the way back to Galen or even just a decade ago, they're not just to understand dietary pasts. They're not just to understand antiquated dietary advice. And in some ways, it doesn't matter what the diet was. There's a larger point that I think is far more important here. Dietary advice reflects culture. Our contemporary sources will eventually be primary sources for future historians. What people are writing now in terms of diet, later historians are going to say, oh my gosh, these people were totally crazy. So, of course, historians later are going to be able to contextualize these sources in a way that we can't in the present day. But that doesn't mean we have to wait for later historians to tell us what they mean. We can read them now as primary sources. We've learned how to do that. And it can tell us a lot about ourselves that we might not see just from reading about nutrition, right? But collectively, they give us a different view onto what we think about science, what we expect from dietitians, what do we expect from people who are trying to establish credibility and expertise. Number 4, sharpen critical thinking about diet health expertise. That's what all these SLOs are about, these learning objectives. My hope is every reading, every assignment helped you do this in different ways. Okay, you've done a tremendous amount of reading, a lot of variety, lots of kinds of publications, kinds of authors, primary and secondary sources, obviously. The variety is very deliberate because I think understanding kind of the ecosystem of dietary advice is instructive in itself. You've done a lot of writing, if you hadn't noticed. I hope the prompts and your reflections have made the ideas from readings stick a little bit more. And again, not the specific details of when was vitamin D discovered. I mean, I don't know. Did it matter that people started keying in on vitamins as a way of understanding health? That's pretty important. That's something we've emphasized the last few weeks. Look, if you've learned anything about the history of diet and health, great. That's awesome. But in some ways, it's a means to an end. My main hope is that you're simply more critical readers about anything and more attuned to see the intermeshed relationship between science and medicine and culture. I hope you've learned to pay attention to the power of rhetoric to create knowledge, right? Which is often, if not always, based to some extent in actual scientific research. But there's a long, convoluted path between that research and something like health advice. So what I hope you can do after this class is approach everything you read with attention to rhetoric, expertise, argument, and evidence. What is the point? How is this person trying to gain trust? What are the assumptions? What kind of evidence is employed? Is it convincing? What kind of alternate views are not being discussed? How is history useful or not in this case? Same questions I ask about all the sources, right? I hope you will continue to think about that. This leads us to the last learning objective. It's actually first on the syllabus because it's the most important. I put it last here so I could sort of build up to it. Question and judge the extent to which ideas of health are constructed as much socially and culturally as scientifically. But this is something you can only really do at the end of the course, and I hope it really comes out in your finals. As I've mentioned many times, looking at the history of diet and health and to the history of science and medicine more broadly suggests that there's very little, not zero, but very little objective scientific knowledge weighting our discovery. Like that just really doesn't happen. We make it up. We decide what to measure. We decide how to measure it. We decide what those measurements mean. And as we've seen over and over again throughout this class, a lot of social and cultural biases go into making those decisions, right? And this is perhaps more evident in looking at the history of diet and health than almost any other science. I want to be very clear. To say there's, very little or no objective knowledge about health, this does not mean nutritional science is fiction, okay? There's an indisputable link between certain vitamin deficiencies and certain diseases. But I want us to keep in mind the giant leap between demonstrable nutritional research that you can get out of a laboratory and the claims about health or diet that grow out of that. I talked about this a little bit last time. There's a long journey there. And we can measure calories in blueberries. This can be factually true because we've established what a calorie is and how to measure it. So of course we can come up with a number. But what does that number mean? How many calories of blueberries should we be eating? How do different bodies respond to different blueberries? So that's a lot of interpretation goes into that, right? Those aren't matters of fact. Even though they seem very clear-cut, there's a lot of decisions that go into it. So histories of nutrition continue to signify vitamins as proof that there are definite links between diet and health. And we read an article that just did that, right? The Future of Nutrition article that you critiqued for your last assignment. And you can see my full critique in the previous video. But what I want to emphasize here is that he's criticizing the fact that we got kind of blinders on in terms of vitamins. We saw these very direct causation relationships and said, we can continue to do this. And we've gotten sort of too narrow in our research. And so the call for the future of nutrition is to think more broadly, right? It's a lot like the Barabee article, but focus specifically on nutrition. And nonetheless, the view that science is going to give us more answers, right? Even if we haven't figured out the right methods for investigating it, science is still going to give us the answers, just as they did for vitamins. That still underlies that article. And you can imagine why the people wrote it that way is because this is what they do, nutrition research. Like the idea that all their work is really not going to be useful, that doesn't really go into your worldview, right? And it's not that it's not useful, but it's just not necessarily going to make us healthier, right? Which is what the point of the article is. How do we get healthier? Well, let's just do more research and a broader view. Okay, but it assumes that there's going to be these definitive relationships as there were for vitamins. That's why the history starts with the vitamins and not all the ambiguous stuff that we looked at previously. So there's real implications with constantly going back to vitamins as kind of, this is one of the origins of nutrition. But what if we see vitamins as the exception that proves the rule? The rule that there just aren't many rules when it comes to diet. And even though we found one, It's harder to point to many other ones. One point I want to mention that's beyond these learning objectives, which is I hope you recognize that every time you read something, anything, not just about diet, you make a choice about its integrity. You have to reconcile what you're willing to accept as true versus what you want to be true. To take a recent example, the all-meat, zero-carb diet, I don't mean to pick on it all the time, but come on. There's no scientific evidence that this is going to be a useful diet. It may make people feel better in the short term for different reasons, but it's not because you're just eating zero carbs. Why would anyone do it? There's really no evidence. People like evidence when it comes to nutrition for the most part, but there is none in this case. Why would people do it? Because people want it to be true. They want diet to be simple. No counting calories, no reading labels, no deciding what to cook, less work in the kitchen. People want diet to be easy, and if your only choice is meat or eggs, then it's really easy. Same for lectins, same for gluten, right? Just focus your attention on these one things, or avoiding this one thing, and you'll be healthier, right? That's the premise of these diets. Everything else is kind of fine. People believe that Sylvester Graham gave great dietary advice, not just because of the scientific evidence he had, and he had a lot, but it coincided with the kind of virtues and the notion of a pure society, people eating whole, natural food that made them whole, natural, virtuous people, right? That's the world people wanted to live in, and they've reflected that in their dietary advice. So I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I hope you all know that. I do hope I've encouraged you to think about how you decide what you want to believe. And as the history of diet and expertise makes very clear, how you decide to take information on board is based on a lot of factors outside of evidence, right? But it comes back to perceived expertise. How much do you identify with the author? How much are they like you? Is it expertise or common sense? Does it sound familiar? Or is it deliberately going against the grain? Does it match your politics? Food and diet are politics. I think a lot of knowledge claims in the world, at least those that aren't completely baseless, are a lot like dietary knowledge. That's to say they're grounded in actual research, but subject to tremendous interpretation to put it into practical use. So I hope you can see and learn from how much the rhetoric of diet reveals about the world. I hope it makes you better consumers about all information. I hope it makes you better citizens. And I hope it makes you more successful in life. And this sounds like ridiculous ambitions for a history course, but it's true. I mean, that's what education is for, right? To get you to think more broadly and more deeply than you would otherwise. See things from different angles, even if you don't agree with them. That's really hard. Some of the ability to do that, see things from different perspectives, comes from knowledge in a specific field, whether it's history or biochemistry or psychology or philosophy, law, whatever. But I'd say most of that ability actually comes from introspection and being able to question and recognize your own views of the world and where they came from and how those influences might affect your thinking about things. And in turn, can you recognize other people's worldviews and how they influence their work? And maybe it's easier to see in others than yourself, but it's a back and forth. Super quick example, just to be a little bit more concrete. If someone gives you a spreadsheet of data, seems like an objective thing, it's numbers, columns, and very organized. You can take that as some objective representation of reality. And I think most people do. Or you can think about how it represents lots of choices about what to measure, about how to measure it, what or who might be excluded from the measurements, how it might distort reality in a way that we didn't think about when the measurement was set up. What can the data really tell us? And the value of that kind of meta-analysis is the reason you have a very self-reflective, introspective final to document and describe your learning experience, to think through and reflect on your own views about diet and health, how they were or weren't affected by the course, and how you decide to believe things about diet and health. So that's the wrap up. Outside of that, I just want to say thanks for your patience with me fiddling with the syllabus constantly. Obviously, I was just trying to adjust on the fly to a class that's never been online before. I know we're all online in a lot of ways we didn't expect. I know you've all made a lot of adjustments for this class and all your classes probably. So I appreciate your time and effort to make this work. It's very important for me to say that I'm grateful for all of your responses on the discussion board. I learn a lot from people who take the assignment seriously. We all read things differently. We all have different interests, different backgrounds, and it shows up in the discussion board. So I've really benefited a lot, and I want to thank you for that. It's a grind. I mean, this class is long. There's a lot of reading. There's a lot of writing. And I hope you feel that's paid off, and I hope you feel it really come together in the next couple weeks as you pull your finals together. In terms of the work you've put in, remember the discussion board is a gold mine for class material, right? Yours and not yours. Skim through it, whether you have or haven't been. Lots of very good work there, as I was just saying. It's only going to make your final better because you're just going to be thinking about different perspectives. Part of the goals of the course, right? Good luck with your final reflections. Make a post in the discussion board if you have any questions, if there's any uncertainty about what you're supposed to be doing. If I can help in any way, please post there. Personal matters, obviously, please send me an email. Okay, that's really it. Best wishes to everyone. Thanks again. Take care, stay in touch, never stop learning. Talk to you later.